In Lagos, there are 3 things you cannot escape: traffic, noise, and wedding invitations. But for 6 young women who worked together at a bank in Victoria Island, one wedding invitation became a death sentence wrapped in expensive lace. This is the story of how social pressure, jealousy, and a cursed piece of fabric turned a joyful celebration into a graveyard. If you think Asoebi is just about fashion, you are about to learn a lesson that 4 women paid for with their lives. The trouble started on a hot Monday morning in December when Kioma walked into the office carrying a small gold-colored envelope. She was glowing with excitement because her younger sister Nkech was finally getting married to a big boy from Lekki who worked in oil and gas. Kioma was the chief bridesmaid, and she had already started planning the perfect Instagram-worthy bridal party that would make the whole of Lagos talk. She gathered her closest friends at work during lunch break: Amaka, Blessing, Funk, Zainab, and Tati. These 6 women had been working together for 3 years and had become as close as real sisters, sharing everything from makeup tips to boyfriend problems. Kioma opened her phone and showed them pictures of the wedding venue, a massive glass hall in Ikoyi that looked like something from a foreign movie. The pictures made the girls scream with excitement because this was not going to be a regular church wedding with plastic chairs and small chops. This was a Lagos Oemb wedding where even the ushers would be dressed better than most people's Sunday best. Kioma then dropped the announcement that made the table go silent. The Asoebi would be a special French lace imported directly from Paris, and each bridesmaid would need to pay 150,000 naira for their own piece. The air became thick with tension as the ladies exchanged uncomfortable glances. Amaka was the first to speak, asking if there was any way to reduce the price or use a local fabric instead. Kioma laughed and said her sister had already ordered the material, and there was no going back because the wedding was only 4 weeks away. Blessing bit her lower lip because she had just sent most of her December salary to her family in the village for Christmas preparations. Funk was planning to travel to Ghana for the holidays, and her budget was already stretched very thin. Zainab had 3 other weddings to attend that month, and she was already drowning in Asoebi debt. Tati was the only one who smiled because her boyfriend was a young politician who spent money like it was going out of fashion. Even though their hearts were heavy with financial worry, none of them wanted to be the one to say no and miss the wedding of the year. In Lagos, refusing to buy Asoebi is like saying you do not value the friendship, and the social cost is sometimes higher than the actual price of the fabric. They all nodded and agreed to pay, even though some of them knew they would have to borrow money or skip paying other bills to make it happen. Kioma clapped her hands in joy and promised them that the wedding would be worth every single kobo because her sister was not playing small. She told them to send their measurements by the end of the week so the tailor could start working on the identical styles she had already chosen. The girls smiled on the outside, but inside, the pressure was already building like a storm cloud ready to burst. 2 weeks passed, and the deadline for payment was approaching fast like a speeding Danfo bus. Amaka, Blessing, Funk, and Zainab were all struggling to gather the money while watching their colleagues buy expensive shoes and handbags to match the Asoebi. The stress was written all over their faces as they calculated and recalculated their budgets every single night. One evening, as Blessing sat at her desk staring at her bank account balance with tears in her eyes, a message notification popped up on her phone. It was from an unknown number that simply said, "I can help you with affordable Asoebi, quality French lace, 50,000 naira only. WhatsApp me if interested." Blessing's heart jumped because this seemed like an answer to her desperate prayers. She quickly shared the message with Amaka, Funk, and Zainab, and they all agreed to meet the vendor after work that same day. The address led them to a small shop tucked away in a dark alley behind the popular Balagun market on Lagos Island. The shop was cluttered with piles of fabric, mannequins wearing dusty wrappers, and the heavy smell of old perfume and mothballs. Behind the counter sat an older woman with very sharp eyes and a smile that did not reach her face. Her name was Mama Caro, and she spoke in a low, rasping voice that made the hair on their arms stand up for reasons they could not explain. Mama Caro told them she had exactly what they were looking for: French lace that looked identical to the expensive material Kioma had chosen. She brought out a roll of beautiful burgundy fabric with delicate gold threading that sparkled under the dim shop lights. The girls touched it and gasped because it felt soft and luxurious, exactly like the real thing. When they asked why it was so cheap, Mama Caro said she had connections with importers who brought her leftover stock from big orders. She assured them that no one would be able to tell the difference between their fabric and the original Asoebi. The girls were so relieved and excited that they did not ask any more questions. They each paid 50,000 naira in cash and carried their bundles of fabric home like they had just won the lottery. That night, as Blessing unfolded her fabric on her bed, she noticed a very faint smell that reminded her of burnt herbs and old incense. She dismissed it as the smell of the dusty shop and decided to wash the material before taking it to the tailor. But when she poured water over the fabric, the water turned a strange rust color, and the smell became stronger and more metallic. She felt a brief moment of worry, but convinced herself that it was just excess dye from the factory. The other 3 girls had similar experiences, but they were all too happy about saving money to pay attention to the warning signs. They took their fabrics to their different tailors and gave specific instructions to copy the exact style that Kioma had shared in the bridal party group chat. Meanwhile, Kioma and Tati had paid the full price for the original French lace, and their outfits were being sewn by one of the most expensive tailors on the island. Kioma kept posting pictures of her fabric and her fittings on Instagram, making everyone jealous of how perfect everything was turning out. She had no idea that 4 of her bridesmaids were wearing something completely different, something that had passed through hands that did not wish anyone well. The countdown to the wedding continued, and the excitement in the group chat was reaching a fever pitch as they planned their makeup looks and hairstyles. The wedding day arrived with clear blue skies and the kind of perfect weather that made people say God was smiling on the union. The venue was decorated with thousands of white roses, gold ribbons, and crystal chandeliers that made the whole place look like a scene from a royal palace. Guests began to arrive in their finest outfits, and the photographers were running around capturing every single expensive detail. The 6 bridesmaids met at the bridal suite early in the morning to get ready together as planned. They were all wearing their burgundy asoebi with gold accessories, and to the untrained eye, everyone looked identical and stunning. Kioma kept hugging her friends and thanking them for being part of her sister's special day. She did not notice that the fabric on Blessing, Amaka, Funk, and Zainab had a slightly duller shine compared to her own and Tati's. The makeup artists worked their magic, and soon all 6 women looked like they had stepped out of a magazine cover. They took endless photos, laughing and dancing to the loud music playing from the speakers. The ceremony went perfectly, with the couple exchanging vows in front of hundreds of guests who clapped and cheered. The bridesmaids stood at the altar looking like a beautiful wall of burgundy and gold, representing friendship and loyalty. After the church service, the party moved to the grand reception hall where the real celebration was about to begin. The MC was a popular Lagos comedian who had everyone laughing with his jokes and commentary. The live band was playing the latest Afrobeats hits, and the dance floor was already packed with guests showing off their best moves. The bridesmaids were seated at a special table right next to the high table where the bride and groom were sitting like royalty. Waiters brought trays of small chops, bottles of expensive champagne, and plates of jollof rice that smelled like heaven. The 6 friends ate, drank, and danced without a care in the world, completely unaware that something dark and terrible was already beginning to stir beneath the surface of the celebration. As the afternoon sun climbed higher and the hall became hotter despite the air conditioning, Blessing started to feel a strange tingling sensation on her arms. She scratched absent-mindedly and continued dancing, thinking it was just sweat irritating her skin. Amaka noticed that her neck felt unusually warm, as if someone had placed a hot iron near it, but she blamed it on the thick makeup and the crowded hall. Funk felt a dull headache starting to form behind her eyes, pulsing in rhythm with the loud bass of the music. Zainab's stomach began to cramp, but she thought it was because she had eaten too quickly. Kioma and Tati, who were wearing the original fabric, felt perfectly fine and were busy taking pictures with the bride. The party continued for hours, with the couple cutting their towering wedding cake and spraying each other with bundles of crisp Naira notes. The bridesmaids joined in the money spraying, dancing in a circle around the newlyweds, while the photographers captured every moment. But as the evening began to approach, the tingling and the warmth that the four girls were feeling started to intensify into something more alarming. Blessing looked down at her arms and saw that her skin was developing small red welts that looked like insect bites. Amaka felt her neck and realized it was burning hot to the touch, as if she had a sudden fever. The smiles on their faces began to fade as a sense of dread slowly crept into their hearts. By the time the reception was winding down and guests were starting to leave, Blessing could no longer ignore the pain spreading across her body. She excused herself and went to the bathroom, where she lifted her sleeves and gasped at what she saw. Her arms were covered in angry red rashes that were spreading like wildfire across her skin. She splashed cold water on her face and arms, but the burning sensation only got worse. When she returned to the table, she saw that Amaka was also looking pale and uncomfortable, constantly touching her neck and wincing. Funk's headache had grown so intense that she could barely keep her eyes open, and Zainab was bent over clutching her stomach in visible pain. Kioma finally noticed that something was wrong and asked if they needed to go to the hospital. The four girls tried to downplay their symptoms because they did not want to ruin the wedding or cause a scene in front of all the important guests. They said they were probably just tired and needed to rest at home. Tati offered to drop them off in her boyfriend's car since she was feeling perfectly fine and energetic. They said their goodbyes to the bride and groom, collected their gift bags, and left the venue while the party was still going strong. In the car, the girls sat in silence, each one feeling a growing sense of fear that something was seriously wrong but not wanting to admit it out loud. Tati dropped them off one by one at their different houses, promising to check on them in the morning. Blessing got home and immediately tore off the Asoebi because her skin felt like it was on fire. She stood in front of the mirror and watched in horror as the rashes continued to spread down her chest and across her back. She applied every cream and lotion she could find in her bathroom, but nothing seemed to help. The pain was now accompanied by a strange itching sensation that made her want to scratch her skin off. She tried to call Amaka, but the phone rang without an answer. Unknown to her, Amaka was also standing in front of her own mirror, staring at her neck, which had swollen to twice its normal size and was covered in dark purple bruises that looked like someone had tried to strangle her. Funk took 2 strong painkillers for her headache and lay down in her dark room, praying that sleep would make everything better. But instead of getting better, the pain in her head grew so intense that she started vomiting violently. Her vision became blurry, and she could hear a strange ringing sound in her ears that would not stop no matter how hard she tried to block it out. Zainab was curled up on her bathroom floor, unable to move because the cramps in her stomach had become unbearable. She felt like something inside her was twisting and tearing, and she could taste blood in her mouth. All 4 women spent that night in agony, too proud or too scared to call for help, believing that whatever was happening would pass by morning. When Monday morning came, Blessing did not show up for work. Her phone was switched off, and her neighbors reported that they had heard strange screaming sounds coming from her apartment during the night, but assumed it was a bad dream. Amaka also did not come to work, and when Kioma tried to call her, the phone was answered by Amaka's younger brother, who was crying and saying that his sister had been rushed to the hospital in the middle of the night. Funk's roommate found her unconscious on the floor of their shared apartment, foam coming out of her mouth and her body cold to the touch. Zainab's mother had broken down her door after she failed to answer repeated knocks and found her daughter lying in a pool of her own blood, her eyes wide open and staring at nothing. The news spread through the office like wildfire, and panic gripped everyone who had attended the wedding. Kioma could not understand what was happening because she and Tati were perfectly fine, with no symptoms or problems at all. The management gave everyone permission to leave work and go check on their colleagues at the hospital. When they arrived at the Lagos University Teaching Hospital, they found the place in chaos. Blessing had been brought in earlier that morning and was in the intensive care unit fighting for her life. The doctors were confused because they had never seen symptoms like this before. Her skin was peeling off in sheets. Her internal organs were failing one by one, and her body temperature was fluctuating between dangerously high and terrifyingly low. Amaka was in another ward, her neck so swollen that she could barely breathe even with the oxygen mask strapped to her face. The doctors said it looked like she had been exposed to some kind of chemical poison, but all the tests they ran came back negative for known toxins. Funk was declared dead on arrival, her brain having suffered massive hemorrhaging that the doctors could not explain. Zainab was still alive, but barely, bleeding internally from multiple organ failures that seemed to have happened simultaneously. The families were screaming and demanding answers, but the medical staff had none to give. This was not a disease they recognized, and the speed at which it was killing these young, healthy women was beyond anything in their textbooks. By Tuesday evening, Zainab took her last breath, her body finally giving up after fighting a battle it could never win. The hospital had to call in specialists from other countries to try and understand what was happening, but even they were baffled. The only common factor was that all 4 women had been at the same wedding, wearing the same color fabric. The police were called in to investigate because the deaths were too strange and too coordinated to be natural. They started questioning everyone who had been at the wedding, looking for signs of food poisoning or some kind of deliberate attack. But the bride and groom and hundreds of other guests had eaten the same food and drunk the same drinks, and they were all perfectly healthy. On Wednesday morning, Blessing lost her fight. Her body had been through too much, and despite the doctor's best efforts, her heart stopped beating at exactly 6 a.m. Amaka was the only one still clinging to life, but the doctors had quietly told her family to prepare for the worst because her condition was deteriorating rapidly despite all the medications and interventions. The city was in shock, and the story had made its way to the newspapers and social media. People were calling it the curse of the wedding, and wild theories were flying around about everything from witchcraft to biological warfare. But no one had yet connected the dots to the fabric itself. Kioma was devastated and could not stop crying because she blamed herself for choosing expensive asoebi and putting pressure on her friends. She and Tati went through every detail of the wedding day over and over again, trying to figure out what could have caused such a tragedy. It was Tati who finally asked the question that would break the case wide open. Kioma, did everyone actually buy the fabric from the same place you ordered it from? Kioma froze because she had assumed that everyone had paid her directly and collected the material from her. But now that she thought about it, 4 of the girls had told her they would handle their own fabric and just match the color and style. They immediately went to visit Amaka in the hospital, and even though she could barely speak, she managed to whisper the name Mama Caro and mention the shop in Balagun Market. Kioma and Tati, accompanied by 2 police officers, went straight to the address that Amaka had provided. When they arrived at the small alley, they found the shop locked and abandoned. The neighbors said the old woman had packed up and disappeared 2 days after the wedding, leaving no forwarding address or contact information. The police broke down the door and entered the dark shop, where they found disturbing evidence of what had really been happening in that place. In a back room hidden behind a curtain, they discovered an altar covered with red cloth, animal bones, cowrie shells, and burnt candles. There were pictures of several young women pinned to the wall, including photos that had clearly been taken from social media accounts without permission. Among the pictures were recent screenshots of Blessing, Amaka, Funk, and Zainab posted on Instagram wearing the asoebi at the wedding. Next to the altar was a large metal pot containing fabric scraps soaking in a dark, foul-smelling liquid that the police later identified as a mixture of dangerous chemicals and traditional poisons. The shop was not just a fabric store. It was a place where curses were sewn into cloth and sold to unsuspecting customers. The police launched a full investigation and discovered that Mama Caro was not even her real name. She was a woman who had been operating under different aliases for years, moving from market to market selling cursed items to people desperate for cheap deals. Through witness statements, they learned that she had a personal vendetta against young, successful women because her own daughter had died years ago from a failed beauty procedure while trying to look like the Lagos girls she saw on social media. The jealousy and bitterness had twisted her mind, and she had decided to punish anyone who reminded her of what her daughter would never become. The fabric she sold was deliberately treated with a spiritual poison designed to activate when exposed to body heat and sweat. The more the person wearing it danced and celebrated, the faster the poison spread through their system. It was a perfect trap for weddings and parties where people would be active for hours without suspecting anything. The original Asoebi that Kioma and Titi wore was completely safe because it came from a legitimate supplier in Paris. But the cheap alternative that Mama Caro sold was literally a death sentence wrapped in beautiful packaging. The police issued a nationwide alert for the woman, but by then she had vanished into the crowded streets of Lagos, perhaps already setting up a new shop under a new name in a different market. Amaka somehow survived, but she would never be the same again. Her neck bore permanent scars from the swelling, and her voice was damaged forever, reduced to a hoarse whisper that reminded her every day of what she had been through. She spent months in physical therapy learning to walk again because the poison had affected her nervous system and left her partially paralyzed. The medical bills bankrupted her family, and she lost her job at the bank because she could no longer perform her duties. She fell into a deep depression, haunted by nightmares of her friends dying in hospital beds while she was powerless to save them. Kioma never fully recovered from the guilt of organizing the wedding that led to 4 deaths. Even though everyone told her it was not her fault, she could not shake the feeling that if she had chosen a cheaper Asoebi or not put pressure on her friends to participate, they would still be alive. Her sister's marriage, which was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, was now forever linked to tragedy and loss. The couple moved abroad within months of the wedding because they could not bear to stay in Lagos, where every corner reminded them of what had happened. Kioma quit her job and withdrew from social life completely, spending her days visiting the graves of her friends and apologizing to their families. Titi was the only bridesmaid who walked away physically unharmed, but the survivors' guilt ate at her like acid. She kept asking herself why she was spared when her friends suffered such horrible deaths. She became paranoid about everything she wore, checking labels obsessively, and refusing to buy anything from local markets. She started attending therapy sessions to deal with the trauma of watching her friends die one by one while she remained perfectly healthy. Her relationship with her politician boyfriend ended because he could not understand the depth of her pain and thought she was overreacting to something that was not her fault. The families of Blessing, Funk, and Zainab demanded justice, but justice was hard to find when the villain had disappeared without a trace. They held a joint funeral that was attended by thousands of people, including many who had never met the girls but had heard their story on the news. The 3 coffins were placed side by side in the church, a painful reminder of how they had stood together as friends in life and were now united in death. The pastor spoke about the dangers of vanity and the importance of contentment, but his words felt hollow to everyone who knew the real story. These girls had not died because they were vain. They had died because they were trying to be good friends in a society that punished people for being poor. The story of the Asoebi that came with a price tag became a legend in Lagos, whispered in markets, and shared in group chats as a warning to young women everywhere. Mothers used it to teach their daughters about the dangers of cutting corners and trusting strangers who promised deals that seemed too good to be true. Churches and mosques invited the survivors to share their testimonies, hoping that their pain would save others from making the same mistakes. The tale spread beyond Lagos, reaching every corner of Nigeria, and even to Nigerians living abroad who sent the story back home as a reminder to their families to be careful. But the real lesson was deeper than just being careful about where you bought fabric. It was about the crushing social pressure that forced young women to spend money they did not have on events they did not even want to attend, just to maintain appearances and avoid being talked about. It was about a culture that valued outward beauty and material possessions more than inner peace and financial wisdom. It was about how jealousy and bitterness could turn someone into a monster who found joy in the suffering of others. And it was about how quickly joy could turn to sorrow when spiritual forces entered the physical world through objects that looked innocent but carried deadly intentions. The government eventually banned the sale of untraceable fabrics and introduced new regulations for market vendors, requiring them to register and document the sources of their materials. But laws could not change the human heart, and there would always be people like Mama Caro who preyed on the desperate and the trusting. The police continued to search for her, following leads that always ended in dead ends, as if she was protected by the same dark forces she had used to kill innocent girls. Some people claim to have seen her in different markets, but by the time anyone investigated, she was gone, like smoke in the wind. Amaka eventually wrote a book about her experience, titled The Price I Paid, which became a bestseller across Nigeria. She used the money from the book to start a foundation that helped young women pay for wedding expenses and other social obligations without going into debt or making dangerous choices. She spoke at universities and corporate events, showing her scars and telling her story with a voice that could barely rise above a whisper, but somehow reached into the hearts of everyone who listened. She made it her life's mission to ensure that Blessing, Funk, and Zainab did not die in vain, and that their story would serve as a permanent reminder of the hidden costs of keeping up with the Lagos lifestyle. Today, if you walk through Balagun Market or any of the big fabric markets in Lagos, you will see vendors displaying their most beautiful materials, calling out to customers with promises of quality and affordability. Most of them are honest traders trying to make a living in a difficult economy. But every now and then, someone will point to a small, dark shop in a corner alley and whisper the story of Mama Caro and the Asoebi that killed 4 friends in 7 days. They will tell you to be careful where you buy your cloth, to ask questions, and to never let social pressure force you into making choices that your spirit knows are wrong. The 6 bridesmaids went to a wedding together, wearing what they thought was just fabric and thread. But 4 of them never made it home, because they learned too late that some price tags are not written in Naira and Kobo. They are written in blood, tears, and the souls of those who thought they were getting a bargain. So the next time you receive a wedding invitation with expensive Asoebi attached, remember the story of Kioma, Titi, Amaka, Blessing, Funk, and Zainab. Remember that not every discount is a blessing, and some gifts come with a price that no human being should ever have to pay. The Asoebi looked beautiful in the pictures they posted online, but it looked even more beautiful to the evil forces that waited patiently for the moment when heat and sweat would activate the curse woven into every thread. 4 young women paid the ultimate price for trying to fit in and be good friends. 2 women survived. But they lost their joy, their peace, and their innocence in the process. And somewhere in the crowded streets of Lagos, an old woman with sharp eyes and a bitter heart is still selling beautiful fabric to unsuspecting customers, waiting for her next victims to walk through her door with money in their hands and trust in their hearts. This is not just a story. This is a warning. Be wise, be careful, and never forget. The Asoebi that came with a price tag taught Lagos that some traditions are not worth dying for.